huge amount of organisational work that gets done by volunteers and local parties around the country, and making any of that sort of work even fractionally better has massive leverage effects. So there are, for example, around 400 local party chairs, around 400 local party treasurers, 400 local party secretaries and so on. So you can imagine if we're able to develop a tool or improve something that maybe makes one of those officers' job a little bit easier, maybe saves them an hour a month on average, that's actually 400 hours of people's time across the country every month that's being saved. There's massive benefits to be had from being able to make what we do a little bit better.
Good morning, conference. This is the debate on ending sewage discharges. Will Charlotte and Barley please stand by? And our first speaker is Tim Farron, who's the MP for Westmoreland and Lonsdale and is also our spokesman on DEFRA. Tim.
Morning, conference. It's lovely to almost see you and to be with you, even if it's still virtually. I'm speaking to you from, I'm going to argue, the most beautiful bit of England, but also the wettest. It is my privilege to represent and to have done this last 17 years, much of the English Lake District. And, water's a big deal to us. We take it very seriously that we are the stewards of this very damp and this very beautiful part of the United Kingdom. And those open bodies of water, which of course give us the name of the Lake District and which are the heart of our tourism economy and of our natural environment, they draw 19 million visitors a year in normal years. And of course, after London, that makes us the second biggest visitor destination in the country. So we're proud of that. I'm proud of that, you can probably tell. But we also take it as a huge responsibility to steward that environment, not just for you, not just for the people who come and visit from this country, but around the world, and of course, the generations to come. It is one of the most beautiful parts of the UK. It is a World Heritage Site. But the reality is that despite this, there is a dark secret, as there is behind every body of water in the United Kingdom, and that is that every year there will be untreated sewage dumped into our lakes and our rivers and our coastline, and that is sanctioned by the government. That is done legitimately. It's done legitimately, legally anyway, not all the time, but when it is permitted, it's permitted because of storm overflows. And in a place like this, with a lot of lakes, why have we got a lot of lakes? Because it rains an awful lot. And the more wet you are, the more likely it is that your local water company will be given the freedom to dump raw sewage into your nearest waterway. If you're not outraged, you should be. In 2020, water companies, ours is United Utilities in the Northwest, they discharged raw sewage in our waterways 400,000 times, lasting a total of 3.1 million hours. United Utilities, our water company, as I said, discharged raw sewage into had one of the longest discharges, in fact, the longest discharge in the country, a single discharge in the Lune Valley near Sedbergh, lasting 8,490 hours. That's roughly a year. Another further north in the Lake District, to Derwent Water, 8,275 hours continuous discharge in the heart of the Lake District. Water companies have been allowed to get away with dumping raw sewage into our rivers, lakes and seas for far too long. And yet the government initially refused to ban this practice altogether and had to be dragged kicking and screaming, largely thanks to our colleagues in the House of Lords, to do so. But even that isn't enough, because all the Tories have done is passed a ambition to clean up our lakes and rivers and to prevent the discharge of raw sewage. But they've not set any kind of a date. So when will this be done? Next year? In 10 years? Sometime? Never? It simply isn't good enough. Our rivers across the country are in an appalling state. Just 14%, 14% are considered to be in a good ecological state. Over half fail the cleanliness test. And something absolutely needs to be done, should have been done before, needs to be done now. That's why this motion is so important. Liberal Democrats have been at the centre of the calls to end the damaging pollution of our waterways by water companies. And not only do we need to set those meaningful targets for water companies to end discharges, we need to strengthen Ofwat to hold them accountable for the damage they're doing. Let's be honest. When United Utilities dump tons of raw sewage into Windermere, the fines that they may or may not, and they've not been prosecuted in the last few years at all, despite being responsible for nearly half of the phosphates in England's largest lake. When they do get fined, they're often fines of a few £1,000s, and actually they'll factor that into their costs. It's cheaper to pay the fine than it is to do the right thing. That's why we need to change the law so they pay a penalty which is fundamentally crippling and which incentivizes them to do the right thing. Local environmental groups, a major part of our proposal in this motion, local environmental groups should be added to the boards of these companies so that executives can be told about the damage they're doing to the environment and prevented from continuing to do that. But more importantly, we need to start taking action to clean up our rivers, lakes and coastal areas, and to do so now. In 2020, the water companies made £2.2 billion in profits. At the same time, they were dumping raw sewage 400,000 times. This is absolutely not acceptable. So that's why we're calling for, and Ed has spoken publicly about this too, a new sewage tax on the water companies who've made this mess in the first place. This tax will be a 16% levy that would in effect increase water companies' corporation tax rate to 30%. And it would raise £340 million a year. And that money will be used to make sure that we clean up the most polluted rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. And of course, by the new regulations, we make sure that the compulsion not to dump raw sewage into waterways would come about right now, not some time in the far distant future. Bill payers would be protected from this rise through new duties and regulations that we've set out in this motion through Ofwat. It is the shareholders' responsibility for these discharges, and they should be the ones who should pay. And if you're making profits of 2.2 billion, you can afford it. United Utilities, just to give you an idea of what this would mean, would pay 54 million a year. Thames Water, 69 million. Severn Trent, 60 million. In the next few months, we will see the amount of sewage water companies discharge in 2021. We'll see those figures revealed. And I'm sorry to say that I expect it to be no different, no better than 2020, proving that the government's new laws have made little or no effect. And that is why this motion is so important. Liberal Democrats need to be able to hold water companies accountable. We need to campaign across the country to end sewage discharges, and we need to protect our environment. This policy is right, and it's going to be popular. Fewer things have prompted the fury of traditional Conservatives more than the government copping out to the mega bucks water companies and letting them carrying on dumping raw sewage in our rivers and lakes. So let's capture that fury, make the Tories pay an electoral price, and make the water of the Lake District as clean as the air above it. Please vote for the motion.
Thank you very much, Tim. Would Zoe Franklin please stand by? Our next speaker is Charlotte Barley. Charlotte is going to be proposing Amendment 2 and also making the case for, we will be taking a separate vote later on, and Charlotte will be making the case for that separate vote for 2 lines to be removed. Charlotte.
Good morning, conference. When I first heard in November that the Lib Dems were calling for extra taxes on water companies, I was appalled. I was already fairly well informed about the water companies in the southeast because I had researched their websites in order to write articles about the poo discharges in the rivers and beaches of Kent for Kent Bylines, of which I am the chief editor. I had also phoned the media offices of the water companies, that's Southeast Water and Southern Water, and I'd phoned Ofwat and the Environment Agency in my research. I found that when I wanted to talk about the poo, these agencies wanted to talk about stormwater. So I'm appalled that the motion does not mention stormwater, in spite of Tim actually emphasising its importance in his speech. So our amendment from Ashford Lib Dems adds stormwater and some facts about it in sentence 6 and 7. The investment needed to fix foul stormwater in England would, I was told, cost some 660 billion, adding about 1,000 to each household bill. But the remedy is not just new pipes or holding tanks. We have to get cooperation from local government, from planning, from developers, from property owners. All of these could be expected to work towards lessening stormwater overflow at a time of climate change. Don't just blame the water companies, which is what this motion does. Their engineers are working on huge new infrastructure, costing millions, and their investment plans, in the case of Southern Water, go right up to 2080. And you cannot reduce discharge by cutting the licenses. Fewer licenses would mean more storm overflow in built-up areas. So delete this part of the motion. How water companies spend money is overseen by Ofwat. So our amendment is more specific about how Ofwat can influence investment and pricing decisions. The Environment Agency monitors the overflows and the licenses, but its staff have been reduced by Tory cuts. So our next clause is about that: reverse the cuts, resource the Environment Agency more. I very much agree with the final clause in the motion as it is, with the proposal that water companies should become public benefit companies, which is part of the policy we voted for last year. So in short, I ask you to support the motion as improved by our amendments. It is important to campaign with clarity on the matter of sewage and stormwater. But if our amendments do not pass as a whole, I request a separate vote on deleting the clause about extra taxes on the water companies. They need more money, not less. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. At conference, I should just clarify that Charlotte was proposing Amendment 1. Could Jacqueline Bell please stand by? And our next speaker is Zoe Franklin, who is the PPC for Guildford.
Good morning, conference. Before I move Amendment 2 this morning, I first want to say how pleased I am that this motion on the ending of sewage discharges has been tabled today, and just want to thank everyone who's worked on it. And I also really want to encourage everyone to keep the sewage tax on the profits so that the funds are available to do the cleanup. Honestly, without that money, that cleanup simply will not happen. The practice of discharging raw sewage into our rivers, lakes and coastal waters was not one that the public was really aware of until late last year. However, once they were, their anger and their disgust at the practice was very clear. In Guildford, a protest led by me and the Liberal Democrat team had nearly 100 attendees with just a few days' notice. These residents came together with us to make it clear to Guildford's MP and the Thames Water that enough is enough, and they will not stand for the dumping of raw sewage into the River Wey and its tributaries that flow through our communities, waterways on which people live, kayak, paddle, walk alongside, allow their dogs to swim, and so many other leisure activities. As I prepared for the protest and did the press on the issue, I was honestly appalled by the extent of the problem. Waterways in Guildford saw 192 sewage discharge incidents, totaling 1,789 hours, the worst of which lasted 476 hours alone. Another stat that shocked me is the fact that the River Wey flowing through Guildford and neighbouring Waverley is one of the worst 23% in terms of the ecological and overall river health. And of course, this situation in Guildford is being repeated across the UK in all of our communities. And two key reasons this practice has become commonplace with water companies are an ageing sewage network that water companies have failed to upgrade properly over the decades since privatisation, and inadequate water infrastructure to cope with the development taking place in our communities. And these are why this amendment, Amendment 2, is so incredibly important. Local councils have the best understanding of local communities, their needs, and the future development plans. They also have the direct connection with the local community through their councillors who are elected by the communities. There is no one better placed to ensure that at a community level, water companies do what needs to be done to end sewage discharges. The wording of this amendment ensures that local government can play its part in ending this practice. Part of that is being empowered to hold water companies to account, ensuring that they tackle the existing problems that are a source of endless frustration for residents and issues in our communities, and also that they can insist that new developments have adequate infrastructure built to keep up and cope with the extra pressure. So, conference, I urge you to support this motion as a whole and Amendment 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Will Eleanor Rylance please stand by? And our next speaker is Jacqueline Bell, who is from North Edinburgh and is a member of the Scottish Party Executive.
Conference, this motion and Amendment 2 go beyond England. As Dunbar Community Council Planning Link, I know the discharge of sewage and other effluent is a Scottish issue too, with questions about the efficacy of Scottish Water, SEPA, councils and Holyrood to prevent problems and enforce action. Dunbar's a coastal town. Our beaches are popular, particularly with surfers. The area is wildlife rich. But it's a victim of house building expansion as East Lothian has to meet Scottish Government targets. Hundreds of homes built on greenfield sites without adequate infrastructure, including drainage and the capacity of the Beltonford Water Treatment Plant. Councils need robust local development plans. Our experience is East Lothian Planning Committee ignoring ours. East Lothian has a reputation as a place where it's easy to get planning permission for hard to develop sites like prime agricultural land around Dunbar. Even where planning officials have recommended refusal, consent has been given with the committee convener saying, no point refusing, the developer will peel and cost East Lothian money. So we have a cumulative pressure on sewage and drainage systems to a point where shit really is hitting the fan at the expense of local residents and environment. There are many examples around Dunbar where there have been warnings from the community, but the responsible bodies have allowed development to go ahead. Whilst at this online conference, I've been dealing with a case that illustrates that point all too well. In 2015, Robertson Homes gained approval for a site out with the local development plan, despite lack of infrastructure. Scottish Water didn't object and did not stop occupation until the point where remedial drainage was installed. Fair Acres has had constant problems. Suds and drainage have still not been adopted by Scottish Water as they're not up to standard. Drains blocked with tankers removing sewage from street drains on at least a monthly basis, toilets back up. And yet Robertson have been allowed in further homes that join us. Drainage and sewage were raised at pre-planning stage. Outline planning was recommended for refusal, but it went through on the planning convener's casting vote, even though 2 members of the committee could not be there. He said it was enabling development for cemetery. 5 years later, no cemetery, houses going up. Though we have major problems, and East Lothian Council and Scottish Water ping-pong about who is responsible, but so far Robertsons have seen no real action. It's been me as a community council hassling. And it was eventually yesterday that the head of development thanked me for raising the issue, and they will now put pressure on Robertson Homes to do something. Conference, we need stronger controls on water companies and also teeth in the planning system.
Could you wrap up, please,
to prevent more like Join Us and Fair Acres. Please support the motion and amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. Would Simon Pike please stand by? And I now call Eleanor Rylance from East Devon.
Good morning, conference. I'm speaking to you from the middle of my ward, which is in sunny today, East Devon. In my ward, I have probably arguably one of the most temperamental rivers in Britain, which is tidal along half its length. It's a small river, it's a meandering river. It's tidal along half its length, and whenever it rains for any length of time, large sheets of water hit it very, very quickly. Now, we also in my ward, we have one of the major growth points for Exeter. So what have we noticed over the last 15 years of the growth points arising? Well, increasingly, we've noticed that those manhole covers in the middle of roads and people's lavatories work both ways. So what's happening here? I suspect that when most of us pull the chain on our lavatory, when we shut the door on the dishwasher, we don't think any further about what happens to our wastewater. We feel thankful when it reaches the road and is beyond our responsibility. But half of our water bills go into the disposal of that water and our foul sewage. So unfortunately, for certain residents within my ward, and I suspect all over the country, they are being the unhappy recipients of quite a lot of other people's effluent at certain times of the year. Now, why is this happening? Because traditionally, Victorian sewers needed stormwater in order to flush. They would flush directly into the nearest river and thence into the sea. Nobody thought about what happens to ecosystems at that time. So traditionally, quite a lot of our stormwater infrastructure has been simply channeled into the foul drainage. Now, in dry times, that's fine. If you live in East Devon in the middle of a rainy time, it's not at all fine. So I am also speaking to you as a district councillor, which is, as you may be aware, the planning authority. Now, we are being whipped by national planning policy to deliver increasingly large numbers of houses on a fairly small fraction of our land mass, because a lot of it is covered by an AONB. What we're actually not getting is the resources to put in place ahead of time the correct infrastructure to cope with the planned number of houses. So 20 years ago, it was known that there would be a growth point of 14,000 houses within my ward area. My local water company, Southwest Water, failed to plan for this with the results that we see today. Although new developments do not channel stormwater into the foul drains, all of the old developments still are, but they also have to cope, these drains, with all the new houses. So we're left with the situation we're in at the moment of poo actually coming out of the drains when it rains very hard. So I would urge you to support Amendment 1. I would actually urge us all to think about a potential deprivatization of the water companies, because it seems virtually impossible to actually force them to carry out essential investment work to separate out foul sewage and rainwater drainage. And I would say that next week at Scrutiny Committee on East Devon Council, we have been granted very, very graciously 1 hour of the time.
Could you wrap up,
fairly minor chair of Southwest Water, and it's very difficult to get hold of them. So that's what that concludes my remarks. Please vote for Amendment 1 and for the motion as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would Jeff Harvey stand by? Our next speaker is Simon Pike. Simon is from West Berkshire in Newbury and is a member of the Federal Policy Committee, and he's particularly going to speak about the amendments which have been drafted into the motion.
Thank you, Conference. So as you heard, I live in West Berkshire. One of our local rivers is the Lambourne, which is a precious chalk stream and the site of special scientific interest. And 85% of all chalk streams in the world are in England, mostly in the southeast. Yet despite the rare and delicate nature of the Lambourne, raw sewage is still discharged into it. I therefore strongly support this motion. I also grew up in Whitstable on the North Kent coast. At that time, raw sewage was routinely piped into the sea perfectly legally. We used to joke that you couldn't swim in the sea, you could only go through the motions. But since then, environmental laws should have prevented that from continuing. However, I was shocked to learn last year that Southern Water had been fined £90 million for illegally dumping between 16 and 21 billion litres of raw sewage into the sea, including at Whitstable. And if you're not good on volumes, that's equivalent to 6,000 to 8,000 Olympic swimming pools. And a protest meeting at Tankerton Beach that I attended attracted many hundreds of residents. So the original motion only addressed sewage discharge into inland waters. So I'm grateful to Conference Committee for accepting my drafting amendment to include the sea, and also to strengthen the requirement for water companies to end the discharge of raw sewage. I was a member of the policy working group that developed the policy paper 140, giving consumers a fair deal. So I also welcome the endorsement by this motion of our proposal for the public benefit company model for water companies. I support Amendment 1, though I'm doubtful that it's appropriate for a regulator to monitor staff remuneration. And I agree with the removal of lines 17 and 18. While water companies should pay for the cleanup of waterways, I think there may be better ways of doing this than a tax on profits, such as perhaps the fees for discharge licenses. I therefore urge you to stop the discharge of motions by supporting this motion with Amendment 1 and without lines 17 and 18. Thank you, Conference.
Thank you, Simon. Would Pippa Halings please stand by? And our next speaker is Jeff Harvey, who is a councillor in South Cambs, who will be summating Amendment 2.
Thank you, Conference. As a councillor at South Cambridgeshire District Council, I am so proud that in the last 5 years, the single most influential document that will determine the future of South Cambridgeshire was commissioned not by the Environment Agency, not by Water Resources East, not by Anglian Water, not by Cambridge Water, and not by Ofwat. Conference by our own Liberal Democrat controlled South Cambridgeshire District Council through our shared planning service with Cambridge City Council. The Greater Cambridge Integrated Water Management Study, published in 2021, for the first time gave us direct evidence with which to scope the limits of new development in our high growth area. What it showed us, Conference, is that of 3 proposed local growth targets, only the lowest was viable without literally running out of water. It declared the water supply shortage as, quote, a deal breaker, and showed that of 3 scenarios of growth to meet local housing need, only the lowest was viable without causing further environmental damage. With low water supply in our rivers and chalk streams, the levels of sewage concentration are inevitably higher. Planners are now compelled to say that if no infrastructure up front to deal with the water crisis is put in place, then this proscribes future growth. The conclusions of that report have fed directly into our emerging local plan, and actually as its single most important input, for it alone has determined the future growth trajectory of our area. As it happens, that report focused mainly on the water supply issue rather than the flip side of wastewater management. But the point is made, conference. Without the oversight of the local authority over a fractured and multi-agency landscape, we would be on a path to an unsustainable future. Conference, I urge you to support the motion and Amendment 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for keeping to time so well. Our final speaker on this debate is Pippa Halings, who's going to be summating the motion as a whole. Pippa is a councillor in South Cambs and is also the PPC for South Cambs.
Thank you very much. Conference, it's time for Liberal Democrats to make this stand. And it's time for a clear and bold policy to end the dumping of raw sewage. The Tories' shameful U-turn ended up with the need to progressively reduce impact only. But the fines aren't working. And Ofwat can only encourage water company boards to progressively reduce because of that. And the Environment Agency has been hobbled by the Tories' crippling cuts over the last decade. This is shown by the fact in 2020, as Tim said, water companies dumped 400,000 times raw sewage into our rivers, chalk streams, lakes, and seas, whilst making 2.2 billion profit. This motion sets meaningful targets and deadlines to end the dumping of raw sewage, not reduce. And it introduces a sewage tax on water companies of 16%, which will raise £340 million to clean up the mess that they've created. Now, in Cambridgeshire region, local water companies have dumped, one of the highest dumps, 8,000 hours worth, whilst in South Cambridgeshire, that was 6,000. And they've been making £300 million in profit during 2020, whilst those dumpages and spillages were happening, with huge bonuses for their CEOs of the local water company. Rewarding what? Failure. We need to put the polluters pay principle into action. And I'm PPC for South Cambridgeshire, as we said, and when I was selected, the national and local press picked up on my campaign and pledge to fight against this. Because in dry areas, just as Jeff has said, where we've got low river flows, any amount of pollution leads to a higher concentration. And this touches a raw nerve for residents. Today, we've seen in The Guardian, ITV News, and in local and national press how this issue is a voting issue. It's a blue wall issue, especially in dry areas suffering water stress. So we need to support those residents, show we care as they do, because in those areas of the South and Southeast region, they are home also to the world's largest amount of threatened chalk streams. So, conference, I ask you to support the whole motion and the amendments to include the sewage tax, because that is critical to holding the water companies to account, and to reduce the licenses, and I would even say to stop the automatic right to connect of water companies, because they are obliged to say they can, even when they cannot. Thank you, Conference.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Now, Conference, we're going to move on to a series of 4 votes. The first vote is going to be on Amendment 1. So we're about to start the voting process on Amendment 1. Thank you, Conference. I can announce the result of that vote, which is 194 people voting for that amendment and 13 people voting against it. So we will include that amendment. Now, we are now going on to a separate vote on lines 17 and 18. That is Conference calls upon the government number 2. So we now move for a separate vote, whether we should include those lines, keep them in the motion, or delete them from the motion. So it will now move to a vote. Thank you, conference. So I can announce that result, which is 46 people wanted to delete that clause and 135 wanted to keep it. So that clause on the sewage tax will stay in the motion. We're now moving on to a vote on Amendment 2, whether to include Amendment 2 in the motion. So we'll now move to voting on Amendment 2. Thank you, conference. I can confirm that Amendment 2, the results are 188 votes in favour of Amendment 2 and 5 against. So conference, so that was carried. We're now going to move to a vote on the motion as a whole with the inclusion of Amendment 1 and Amendment 2. So we'll move on to the final vote now, please. Thank you. Thank you, Conference. I can confirm that the motion with the amendments has been passed by 250 votes to 4 to 1 against. So thank you very much for this conference. It's a topic that I know is of great interest to voters, so I'm very glad we've got a policy on it. So thank you to all our speakers. Thank you to my aides, Matt McLaren and Councillor John Ball. Just to remind you, Conference, that the item after the next one, motion F16, has been withdrawn. So after our next item, we're going straight to lunch, and we're reconvening at 2:15 with a motion about the situation in Tigray. Our next speaker is the MP for Edinburgh West, Christine Jardine, who is also our Treasury spokesman. So over to Christine.
Hello, Conference. I'm Christine Jardine, as some of you probably know, and this is round about the time where I'd say it's nice to see you again and to be back in York or Brighton or Bournemouth. Unfortunately, life isn't like that again just yet. And while I'd prefer it to be like that, I thought, why not turn that on its head and use this as an opportunity to explain to you not just what I think we should do and what I believe in, but how I came to that conclusion and why I believe it. So I've come here to Clydebank because this is where I am from, and this is still who I am. For the first decade and a half of my life, I lived with my family in rented accommodation about a mile from here, Scottish Special Housing Association. That was the norm in industrial Glasgow and Clydeside. But the industry which dominated all our lives, shipbuilding, was sinking. And all around me there were people who, I didn't realise it then, but were struggling. We were a wee bit luckier. My dad didn't work in that sector. My mum, she did part-time. She went out to earn a wee bit extra so she could give her girls the life that she wanted to give them. But we paid a heavy price for that as a family. I'm standing at the memorial in Clydebank to the people who lost their lives to asbestos-related conditions. And my mum, Agnes Jardine, is just up there. She would have preferred Nessie, but that's how it goes sometimes. And people probably think I've had quite a good life, and I have been lucky. And they think that I probably come from some comfortable middle-class background with a detached house in a well-heeled suburb. No, I didn't. I come from here. This is who I am. And when I look back, I didn't realise how lucky I was. I lived in a nice home with a happy family. We had great presents from Santa every year. And we didn't really appreciate what life was like. Until that is, my dad died when he was 44. Suddenly my mum was a single parent with 2 girls still at school. I was 20. And she went back out to work to look after us. And I am immensely proud, not just at the way they turned out, but how my mum managed to keep our family together and give all of us the life that she worked so hard to make sure we had. And if I hadn't known it by then, I learned very quickly. Your life can be turned upside down. You can lose everything that is important to you in a heartbeat. And that's influencing me now when I look around me and I see people struggling with the impact of the pandemic over the past 2 years. Families who were settled, parents who had good jobs, people who had taken the skills that they'd learned and created businesses, lives for themselves. They're seeing it undermined, in some cases swept away completely by something we had no control over, but it's affecting both our health and our financial well-being. Now those same families, they find themselves facing a crippling cost of living crisis. The original cause has been the huge spike in the world cost of energy. But potentially it's going to be made worse by a war in Ukraine, which defies any moral justification at all. All of that is taking place against the background of a climate emergency that we just can't get on top of. We can't get on top of tackling the threat to the very planet itself. And what is the government doing? The government is hiking up national insurance charges and introducing a stealth tax that will hit those who've been worst affected the hardest. Now, all you have to do is look at one issue, housing. Now, I mentioned that we used to live in rented accommodation and that was the norm. But this was, for the most part, quality housing provided by local authorities and post-war government who'd worked hard to ensure that there were good homes fit for people to live in. But we were all a bit aspirational then. People wanted to own their own homes. My folks did too. They bought their house. And here's the thing. I started paying my first mortgage when I was 26. Now, you tell me how many people you know of 25, 26 nowadays who can get a mortgage. Unless, of course, they're lucky enough to have the support, perhaps, of the bank of mum and or dad. But it's very different then. Most of my working life, building societies were offering me loans at 2, 3, 4, even 5 times our joint salary. You want a bigger house, Mrs. McDonald? That's not a problem. Come see us, we'll help you. That's not going to happen for this generation. And we need to change that. We need houses and we need them now. Not luxury houses in the green belt, but the right type of houses in the right place at the right price, whether that's for rent or to buy. But there's one phrase I don't like, and that is affordable housing. Affordable housing? All housing should be affordable. The 5th largest country in the world, people should not be struggling to put a roof over their own heads. And that comes back to this government and its lack of reality, completely out of touch with what people in this country need today. They tell us all the time how well we're recovering from the pandemic. Well, you know, maybe they need to come and talk to some of my constituents. Or better yet, they could have listened to some of the voters in Chesham and Amersham and North Shropshire who made it very clear that they were unhappy with the government that many of them had voted for. So what do we need? I'll tell you what we need. We need an increase in more home discounts, we need an uplift in universal credit, and we need targeted support for the people who need it most. Those of us who are not in government have been pushing for the last 2 years for the 3 million people who were excluded from government schemes to be supported, to have the support that everybody else had. Furlough should be extended to cover everybody, and there should be more support for small businesses. That's what the government should be doing. Those of us who are not in government are pushing for that. Now we're pushing for more, tougher, swifter sanctions against Russia for the war in Ukraine. And yet again, the government is dithering. So what can we do? Well, whether you're an MP, an MSP, a member of the Senate, or a councillor or an activist, you can get out there and you can convince people that there is a better way to do things. Not just because you're in politics, but because you're a person who gives a damn. A person who gives a damn about people and the lives that they lead. During this pandemic, we've seen incredible acts by people and things that we've begun to take for granted. At the start of the crisis, my caseworkers, other caseworkers, MPs themselves, we were up late into the night ensuring that we could get people home from all across the world. We took up individual cases, all of us, and we're doing the same again now over Ukraine. This past week, we've been pushing for help for a woman who came to our office. She's Ukrainian. Her husband is British. She'd escaped from the war and she was on a visitor's visa in this country. And she came to see us with her mother-in-law. And they said she needs a visa or they're going to put her out of the country, they're going to deport her. Where is she going to go? We spent a week chasing them. And finally on Friday afternoon, an email dropped into my inbox that confirmed that she can have a family visa and she can stay in this country. But you know what? It shouldn't have taken that. How can this government expect people who are fleeing for their lives, who are taking what they can and leaving everything else that they know and love, the people that they love, just to save their lives. How can they expect them to take the time to make sure they've got the paperwork for a visa, whichever country they get to? It's not good enough. And we will not rest until we make a difference. And I know you won't either. So let's get back out there. Let's get campaigning. Let's do what Liberals have been doing for 100 years. Think back to Lloyd George, to Asquith, Beveridge, and think about what we can do in this century. What we need to offer people now is a new vision, a new way ahead, a new Beveridge for the 21st century, a different way of doing things that will support people who need it and people who deserve it, and will make sure that those companies which have made a fortune out of the pandemic, because there are some, and those companies which are now making vast profits out of the gas price crisis, they pay a windfall tax to make sure that others don't suffer. You know, when I was growing up here, the shipbuilding industry dominated everything. This part of the town actually always felt a wee bit as if it was in a shadow. The ships often, overhung the houses and miniaturised them. Now, there is still a cloud that hangs over this area. It's a different cloud. And it was created by the industry itself and working in conditions with asbestos, and a factory just down the road that was spewing out dust, poisonous dust, that was a byproduct of the manufacture of asbestos. The lesson that I have taken for that, and I brought into politics with me, is that we cannot rest today and assume that everything is going well. We have to be on our guard all the time, or the next generation will suffer the consequences. We've suffered it here in Clydebank. I've suffered it personally. There are thousands of other people who have suffered it because they couldn't rely on the air that they were breathing being clean. It's a basic principle of life. You need to breathe. You need clean air. And as we tackle all the problems we have to assure that front and centre is sustainable energy and a greener economy. Now, I know I don't have to convince all of you. All of you agree with that. But what we have to do is get out there and work with all the other people out there who agree with us, who yearn for the sort of progressive, green, sustainable country that we do, and convince them that there is a different way, there is a better way, and we can do it.